All right, I can see my slides. I hope everyone else can.
We can, yes.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Ben. I appreciate it. Hardly a legend, trust me. Andrew apparently wanted to put some butts in the seats, and I'm glad that's worked out well. I'm not good enough or old enough for that Navicare, but you guys are lucky because you've already heard from Terry and Alex and Mark, and those guys are the ones who know the river the best. And they've already told you many of the things that we'll cover right now in summary. I can assure you the only time that I'm the best shad fishing on any river is when I'm fishing alone. So I am honored and humbled to be here. And I just want to let everyone know that I normally give a handout at Shad Night in person to folks. And that handout covers pretty much everything you're going to see in these slides. So don't worry about missing anything. You can email me, and I'm happy to provide you with that handout and answer any questions you might have. I also want to note that you're going to see some great photos tonight, and many of them are from David Hills, a photographer, and you can find his work at fishypictures.com. So with that, some questions to ponder as we move into the presentation is, are you going to be on the river when the fish are biting? We can learn some of the most important factors of shad fishing. And for those who think that you know fish that fight better than shad, if you hunt river smallmouth or if you tangle with bluefish in the saltwater, you might have an argument for the best fighting fish. But if you want to join the shad fraternity, you're not going to start any arguments because we're a very polite and friendly bunch. So tonight we're going to try to cover very quickly the who, what, when, where, and how to catch shad. If you don't know why you're here, I can't help you much with that. But we're going to talk about what rivers you can find shad on. We're going to talk about how to read those rivers, when the best conditions are that produce the most fish, some common rigs and tackle that you can use. And you've already heard Alex covered the rods very well earlier on. We're going to talk about some techniques of how to catch them, and then who to chat up on the river. So first, the quarry. An American shad on the left, a hickory shad on the right. The most distinguishing physical feature that is different between these two is that hickory shad have an underbite. Their lower lip extends beyond their upper lip. If you look closely at these two pictures, which are dentin prints, you'll also notice that the mouth of an American shad normally extends to the back of its eye or beyond, and that's not normally the case with hickory shad. But I would tell you that what you really need to know is that American shad are bigger, meaner, paler, usually more olive in the Potomac, and have a more rounded shape, while hickory shad are brighter, more silvery, purple hued, and more angular. So don't worry if you mess them up, they're both fun to catch. This is my shad partner and friend, Phil Kirchner. He has a nose for fish and a phenomenal touch. He's holding an American shad on the left with distinctive black tail fins, which is sort of a Potomac uniqueness, and two hickory shad on the right. Phil is so good at fishing that he's actually running his own guide service now. You can find him at Wide River Guide Service on Facebook. But another reason I'm showing this picture is not just for the fish, but it's for the fact that, as Mark often does during shad nights, we encourage you to handle these fish with great care and whenever possible, not take them out of the water. They are actually very fragile. They don't like to be out of the water. They don't like light at all. And they're very easy to injure. So over the past couple of years, we rarely take fish out of the net. We take a lot of pictures in the water, as you'll also see in Mark's shad reports. We encourage you to do likewise. And we understand if you catch a lunker, you want to take a picture of it, and that's awesome. So if it's your biggest fish ever, get a picture of it before it goes back, but otherwise treat them with care if you can. So where do you find them? Obviously, Fletcher's is one of the best spots on the East Coast for American shad. The only river that exceeds it in terms of numbers and size would be the Delaware. But for those of us in Maryland and Virginia, the other haunts that you'll find them at are listed here: the Susquehanna underneath the Conowingo Dam, including Deer and Octorara Creeks, Red Bridges on the Choptank, the Gunpowder River, the Patuxent. All of the estuarine streams of the Delaware, of the state of Delaware, have hickory runs, and some are now experiencing American shad runs. Brandywine Creek, in fact, just had a dam removal, and it's expected that Brandywine is going to be a popular spot over the next couple of years for American shad. And in Virginia, the Occoquan, the Rappahannock, and the James, and there's actually a fantastic fishery right in downtown Richmond if you get a chance to experience it. For me, though, the question is always,
what do you mean you're not
going to Fletcher.
That is my lovely wife from Bayonne. And you might be thinking Goodfellas or The Sopranos, but neither of us are Italian. My wife uttered those words after I had loaded the kayak, rigged all my rods, prepped my lunch, got everything ready. And she couldn't believe that I had done all that to not go to Fletcher's. It just so happened we were going to fish for white perch in April that year. And while we had a great day perch fishing, we still were talking about Fletcher's as the day went on. This is a picture of the Gunpowder River. And I show this for two reasons. One, the smaller streams can be much more intimate, more like a mountain trout stream than the main stem of the Potomac or the Susquehanna River. But also the water clarity in the Gunpowder is such that it's probably one of the only places where you can experience sight fishing for hickory shad. You can see the way they move in the stream and the way they bite. And you guys know this already, but they swipe at lures like a sailfish or a swordfish. They're not going to slurp it or suck it in like a bass or a trout. And it's really interesting to watch that happen. And I'd say what's most interesting is how many fish are actually missing when you're fishing for shad. This is the Holyoke Dam on the Connecticut River. And I show you this for one simple reason, and that is that blockages in rivers stack up shad. So these are the shad going over the fish ladder. This is what they look like underwater and how many are there. And you may be thinking, but John, there's no dam on the Potomac. Well, there is, there's Little Falls, but also Fletcher's is really the stopping point. The cove is a natural stopping point for the fish, and they're going to stack up behind blockages in the cove. So how do you find those places? How do you find your place in the river? John McPhee emphasizes in his book that Mark mentioned, position counts. And there's going to be days out in the river where someone next to you is catching a ton of fish and you're not, even though you're doing the exact same things with the same lure at the same depth. Shad will run in certain channels of the river. And I would say the most important facet of finding your piece of the river is finding that eddy wall, the edge of a current seam that separates the slow moving water from the fast moving water. And think of it from the top down. You can see those seams on the surface, but think if there was a blanket going from the top of the seam to the bottom, what that would look like, how it might be moving in the current of that day, and make sure your lures, whether they're darts or flies or spoons, are moving through that wall. That's typically where you're going to find the fish. American shad are often found in the deeper channels, while hickory shad can be found throughout the water column. And my advice, particularly for those that are beginners, is try to learn a few spots on the river well. That's what I've done, and I think that really pays off in a sense that you'll know those spots better, you'll avoid getting snagged, and you'll have a sense of whether or not it's going to be a good time to fish your favorite spots. So that gentleman that you see in the orange cap is Mike Bailey, the leader of Friends of Fletcher's Cove and a shad catcher extraordinaire. And I don't want to make Mike a guy like who's leading a Bassmasters elite tournament on the last day and have him surrounded by people. But if you wanted to watch one person fish for shad, I recommend watching Mike. Watch him from the bank, watch him in his boat. He has a phenomenal touch. He knows where the fish are. You could see where he's anchored here. He's on a seam, he's on a current seam, and he's far enough away from his fly fisherman friends behind him that he's not creating any difficulties in terms of having both boats fish successfully on their seams. On the right-hand side, I merely took a picture below Bloody Dam on the Patapsco in winter. There's a sweeper in the water that actually is right behind Mike. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's creating a little eddy on the far bank. And if I were fishing this spot in waders, I'd make sure that my lures cross that current seam between the faster moving water on the right and the slower moving eddy towards the bank. This is Sarah Schott. Sarah is fishing at Gordon's Rock. And Mark sort of mentioned the shore fishing. And if you think about spots, Gordon's Rock is one of the best places to be. It is literally a place, a holding pen for pre-spawn and spawning shad. They're almost always there. And the way in which you get to Gordon's Rock is pretty simple. You follow the main trail north from the boathouse over Maddox Branch, and you walk up until you could see that it's safe to descend to the bank. And there's a series of boulders that you could see Sarah standing on that are safe to fish from. There are overhanging branches, so it pays to find a spot where you can make casts. And I've noted here on the Friends of Fletcher's Cove website, they actually have a map of landmarks that includes not only the landmarks on shore, but more importantly, little fish with hooks in their mouth that show you where you're going to find the most fish on the Potomac. This is one of the best fish pictures of all time. That's Annie Fong. She caught that amazing American shad in this similar stretch of river known as Gordon's Rock. You'll see behind her, she actually caught that on a fly rod, which is just truly amazing because even an experienced person who's been fishing for a long time surely would have difficulty casting a fly rod from that area. So congrats to Annie. Her dad's a phenomenal fisherman as well. And I think that's one of the best fishing pictures I've ever seen in my life. So I'll pause there for a second, Ben. That covered sort of the where, and if there's any questions, we can certainly try to field a few.
Yeah, I have one here for you, John. Are shad like salmon in that they return to the same place that they were hatched? You might be covering this in the next section. Apologies if it's so.
No, so that is the thought. Most people, in McPhee's book, I believe he says that only 1 or 2% of shad wind up in their non-natal streams. So they do in fact return. And I'll point out, one of the reasons it's such a fragile fishery is that many shad will in fact die after spawning. So they're thought to come back in their 3rd or 4th year, sometimes their 5th year, and spawn. And in rivers like the Potomac, it varies, but folks think 30, maybe 40% could be return spawners, but many of those fish are just going to spawn once, which makes it all the more important to care for them while they're in the river.
And one more here, John. What about the Anacostia? Any shad there?
That's a great question. I have not heard of any, but I would not be surprised at all if the hickory and herring are beginning to make runs up the Anacostia. I know it's getting cleaner. I would have to defer to Mark or others if they've heard any reports of American shad in the Anacostia. It is a much muddier bottom there, so it's probably not a preferred spawning habitat relative to other creeks that are available to shad on their migration up the Potomac.
Great.
Awesome.
We'll let you go ahead with the presentation.
Fantastic. So the question of when are they in the river? I'm going to give you the basics. The best time of year is usually from late March through mid-May. The shad have been arriving earlier and earlier, and they've been staying later in some years. I like to fish an average flow. So in other words, an average river gauge height. And I'll give you the links to find those gauge heights. There's a USGS gauge at Little Falls, which I spend hours looking at every spring. For me, an outgoing tide is great. And if you can find strong tidal fluctuations, good current that's consistent over a longer period of time, that typically helps the bite. The water temperature you've already heard, 50 is the magic number for their arrival, but the best fishing is usually high 50s to low 60s. And shad are thought to spawn in that 64 to 66 degree temperature range. And for the most part, from my readings, it's very similar for hickories and Americans, although hickories typically precede Americans both in their arrival and probably their departure as well. They're more hyper and they show it in terms of how quickly they move out. The ideal weather conditions for a day would be a calm, warm day with light winds that are not blowing upstream. And that, and sometimes even light rains, that typically produces the most prodigious catches on the Potomac. Water clarity is important. Tracking turbidity on that USGS gauge is important. Less than 10 is usually pretty good. Even lower can be better. The shad need to see your offerings. Here's a quick natural way to figure out when you should be fishing. When the redbuds and cherry trees are blooming in DC, the hickories are going to be running thick. Look at the National Park Service website for the prediction of the cherry bloom. At peak bloom, there's normally a lot of hickories that are easy to catch in the river. And then if you wait a little bit, when the dogwoods bloom and the shad bush, be ready for the Americans to show up. And I would point out for those that are traveling to the area for the first time, you're very fortunate in that Canal Road itself has a median and riparian zone, on the riverside. And there are a lot of redbuds and dogwoods in that area. So you can literally see this as you're coming to the river and see the trees bloom over time and where they are. And it really helps understand where the run is. So if I have any skill in shad fishing, it's spending a lot of time looking at the river levels, the river temperature, the turbidity, and trying to figure out when the conditions are good to catch fish. And the best days are going to occur at the confluence of the arrival of large schools of shad with good river conditions. So you have to be flexible. If you want to be there on the best days, you have to be willing to take off work or leave early. And a real legend on the river, Mike Alper, who presented a few years back at Shad Night, indicated that he most likes a gauge height of about 4.5 feet at Little Falls and 57 degrees as the factors, the conditions that usher in the arrival of the biggest American shad. So that would be the time to be there if you can. Ben, any questions about the timing?
Yeah, there are a couple here, John, and there's one that came in actually from the last section, which I might start with. It was just asking with how is the Chad fishing on the Virginia side of Fletcher's?
So the Virginia side is deeper. It's typically more of a place that folks would target white perch. For those like Alex who are adept at drifting for stripers, they're certainly going to venture into that area. For the most part, I concentrate my efforts more on the DC side, but there's undoubtedly spots where you could find shad on the Virginia side. It offers, I think, less in the way of the ledges and boulders and blockages that create the spots where shad are going to congregate. So I think it's a little bit more difficult to fish. And to be perfectly honest, I haven't spent a whole lot of time on the far Virginia side. As you move upriver towards Chainbridge, there are certainly areas where the Virginia side can be very productive.
That's great. Thanks, John. And there's another question here related to what you just said. Are there any safe and easily accessible shore fishing sites north of Chainbridge?
So north of the bridge itself, it does get rather challenging. And so one thing I'll point out now, which was I think I was going to point out a bit later, is that when you start moving and scrambling on the rocks that are in that area of the river, you have to be very cognizant of the tides. If you go out on a rock perched in the middle of the river at low tide, you may be surrounded by 4 feet of water a couple hours later if you're not careful, and it may be dark. So it can get dangerous up there. To be perfectly honest, I would almost recommend if you're going to fish that area of the river that you wear a life jacket, even on the rocks. It's a dangerous spot. I have fished above Chainbridge 1 or 2 times. It's difficult to cast to where you're typically going to find the shad. There are lots of blue cats up in that area. And again, Alex or others can weigh in. It seems that area is a more commonly a schoolie striper spot than a shad spot. It's super fast moving water, and it doesn't really present as many areas where the shad would actually stop and spawn. So it's tough to fish, but it is beautiful up there, and just be careful if you head up that way.
Awesome. Thanks, John. We have a few more questions here, but I think we'll go on to the next section and come back to them at the end.
Awesome. Well, this is the longer section on and what we're going to be fishing with, what the lures are, and what the tackle is. So my favorite tackle to use is a light spinning rod, 6.5 to 7 foot long. You heard Alex say 4 to 6 pound braided line. I totally agree. I tend towards a very small reel. I'm comfortable with ultralights. If you want to cast further, obviously you want to move up in size to a 2500 series or a 3000 series. You know, shad are in every man's fish. They're easy to catch when they're in the river. You don't need expensive tackle. So use what you're comfortable with that you can cast out, and you'll be just fine. Obviously, common sense and logic would tell you that if you want to cast further, use a longer rod from shore, a shorter rod from a boat, or based on your personal preferences. Noodle rods and rods that are used for salmon fishing have become tremendously popular on rivers like the Delaware, where folks want to cast out really far and keep the weight of their lures very low. I've enjoyed using a noodle rod. You do have to be careful. If you get snagged using a rod like that, it's much easier to snap a 10 foot long rod than it is your 6 foot long lightweight spinning rod. So my caution would be careful and probably, pull your line straight as opposed to using your rod to try to pop off lures, or you will wind up sacrificing a few to the river. All right, let me go back to that slide one more time. I did want to say one important thing. When I say a light spinning rod, I mean a spinning rod, not a bass spinning rod, not a bass jig rod, not an inshore fishing rod. So these are rods that are rated for 4 to 8 pound test, 4 to 10 pound test, not anything bigger. So there are light rods in different categories of fishing rods that are going to be much too heavy for shad. You do want to have a rod with a softer tip and one that allows the shad to hook themselves, which is what they often do. So fly fishing, you heard it from the best guys. Most of these folks are using somewhere between a 7 and 8 weight to a 9, a full sinking line or shooting taper. You saw Terry and Alex tie flies. That's exactly what you want to be using, those small, compact, bright flies. And then the other tips and methods are similar in a sense that you need to be able to find that good position, get your lures down to the depth of the fish, and determine what type of retrieve they're most interested in on any day. So I will defer. I know there's a lot of fly fishermen on the call, and I appreciate you all, and I'm going to learn to do it myself one day. But if there's questions on fly fishing, you're going to want to direct them to Mark and Alex because they're the experts. So rigging for spinning or bait casting tackle, there's limitless possibilities. There's so many different things you can do for shad fishing. It can be as simple as a dart on the end of a monofilament line with no hardware at all, or folks on many rivers are now using downriggers and slip bobbers and all kinds of crazy stuff. But the basics are darts, spoons, small plastics, and the flies. And then you have to ask yourself a question, do I want to double up or not? So if you're just starting out, a single dart with or without a split shot is all you're going to need. Chartreuse, as was mentioned earlier, super popular color. I'll get more into colors later. In terms of leaders, I also use braided lines. So I use a leader with that line. When I first started fishing, I used to fish really light, 2 and 4 pound test. I found that it's not necessary. Shad are not that line shy. I was smart enough to listen to Mark and Mike Alper and others who are using 10 pound tests. So I've moved up to 6 and 8 pound tests for my leaders. And if you're going to do double rigs, I would suggest 8 or 10 pound tests because 1, you could catch 2 fish and you don't want them to snap the 4 pound test. And 2, you're more likely to get snagged here and there. And if you're going to pop it off a rock or the bottom, you're not going to do as well with such a light line. You're going to want something a little heavier, a little more durable to make that happen. So why do you double up? Well, you double up to catch 2 fish because it's fun, but you do it for depth control and for the increased attractiveness because you're offering 2 lures and you're trying to find that school of shad. And what hasn't been mentioned yet is that shad are thought to school up in single lines, maybe not single lines, but in sort of in groups that are coming at you. They're not going to circle around. They're not in a giant area. They're oftentimes in just a couple of feet of water swimming towards you upriver. And so it is important to ensure that you're finding that school. And one of the things that I agree with, and people argue, I know some folks prefer a slightly larger lure for American shad and smaller for hickory, but when in doubt, a small size works better. And I'll use a smaller size lure with extra weight to get it down deeper rather than going to a bigger lure. So the most common combinations are your dart, spoon, dart, and small plastic. So again, here's why you do it. Phil again on the left with the 2 hickory shad. That's me on the right with 2 American shad from shore. And while it sounds cool and it can be fun to catch 2 American shad, to be perfectly honest, they fight so good. I'd probably rather catch 1 at a time because they're going to have a tendency to fight against each other, maybe mess up your lines, maybe break off. So while it's fun, 1 at a time for Americans is good enough for most of us. So the big question, right? What color are they biting? And I think Alex and Terry stole my thunder, which is that they bite a lot of colors as long as you're in the right spot and you're doing the right thing. So if I had to bring one, I agree with them. Chartreuse is probably the go-to color on the Potomac because of the turbidity of the water that typically exists. A silver or gold spoon works as well. My preference is for gold, but as Alex said, it's an argument, a never-ending argument. I have 6 shad books. 3 tell you to use gold in the turbid water and silver in the clear, and the other 3 tell you the opposite. So my advice would be go more subdued, lighter and natural colors when the water's clear. So whites, pinks, blues, silver spoons. When the water's stained, that's the time to take out your brighter, darker fluorescent colors. And Alex noted, and I think it's important to mention again, black and purple can work. I've not personally used them a heck of a lot over the years, but I've been hearing from many good fishermen who do. And so take that to heart. That's a secret you might want to take away from tonight. And also, as everyone has said before, it's confidence. It's confidence that you have in the lures that you're throwing. So find a dart shape that you like, find a lure that you like, whether it's a twister tail, a spoon, a certain shaped dart, stick with it. It'll produce if you have confidence in it. A couple of details and nuances about why I fish the things I do. You use split shots for a couple purposes. They add weight, but they also prevent debris from fouling your hook. So particularly if you're dead sticking or there's a lot of catkins in the water, that little split shot's going to deflect some of those so they don't get down to your baits. And you want to make sure when you're shad fishing, your baits are clean, shiny, and not in any way fouled. So the rest of these bullets are around that point. Keep your lures clean and shiny. I prefer gold hooks if I can find them. It's not always possible, but the locket starts that Alex sells at the boathouse normally have gold hooks. And then in terms of depth control methods, there are a number, and we're going to touch on those now. So the four most common lures: darts, spoons, plastics, and flies. If I had one choice, 1/8 ounce dart is an all-around great weight. If it's an undressed dart, you might want to put a small 1-inch grub on it. I prefer Flashabou over bucktail, but you'll see that most darts are sold with bucktail. In terms of spoons, my preference is for flutter spoons, which are very popular on the Delaware. You all are familiar. Nungesser is a popular brand. Castmasters, those can all work great. And again, it's really a matter of personal preference. For the plastics, we have very, very much moved towards the stingers as the preferred plastic. They seem to work well. They're made locally by a place called Bustin' Baits. There's plenty of other manufacturers, but the Bustin' Baits are great. They're easy to re-rig. It's easy to pick a different jig head size to fish them. And then flies and customs, we'll talk about those. You saw some of them made. Shad Killers are the main one. So I'm going to run through these quick so we have more time for questions. But darts, not surprising, chartreuse and white. As I mentioned, I've liked the darts with Flashabou. The ones in the middle, the chartreuse and the purple and white, were made by Peter Groves. He had a site called Woo Fish. He was a fantastic advocate of shad fishing. He's no longer with us, but his darts remain some of my favorites. They're sort of an odd size. They're probably a little heavier than an 1/8, and they just have a fantastic action in the water. Otherwise, what you could see here is bright and short skirts on most of these. These are the darker colors that you're typically going to fish when the water is a little off. I rarely fish those big ones on the bottom, but I do like orange as a color. Green in the middle, those are locket darts, all of them actually, and that has become a very popular color. It's a good all-around color. It works in both clear water and turbid water. It's also incredibly popular in other places like the Tar River in North Carolina and some of the southern haunts where there's big shad runs. So certainly something to consider. You'll notice there's a little black dart on the upper right, and orange and black would be great choices if the water's a little turbid. Here are some spoons. Like every other shad lure, they come in a myriad of colors. You really there's just endless possibilities. I personally normally use a very simple silver or gold hammered spoon. So the silver one is the third down in the first column, and the gold one is the second one down in the third column. The painted spoons on the bottom are from Hardcore Shad Spoons, a local guy out of Pennsylvania who's pretty good. Lockett's also sells spoons, and you could see that most of these lures have the little split ring attached, and I would recommend using a split ring or a little snap, but you can tie directly using a Rapala knot or a loop knot to a spoon. All right, So the plastics have become our go-to because they're cheap and they're easy and they catch fish. So 3 things I want to point out about this slide. Obviously, you guys can see that there's grubs on the top, 1 inch the top row, 2 inches the second row. The third line down are those bust and bait stingers, and the fourth are tubes. So a couple things to point out here. One is that this would be my order of color preference. If I was creating a new shad box and buying lures, chartreuse, white, green, orange. Those would be the 4 I would want to have with me at all times. There are plenty of days when pink can be hot or purple can be hot, but these are 4 colors I wouldn't want to leave the house with. The other thing I'd like to note is in the bottom left-hand corner, the 2 silver jig heads are actually lead-free jig heads. They're made out of bismuth and tin. I'm happy to provide the company. It's actually leadfreejigheads.com. They work great. They have strong hooks, and they keep lead out of our waterways. So I encourage you to consider using them. And then in the middle, I just note that if you have any shad darts that have lost their bucktail, or the little gold dart that's undressed is a trout bomb. They're sold everywhere, but they're sold with different little tails on them that are mainly for trout. They're very effective. They're very light. They could also be used with the 1-inch grub. So either of those 2 darts with the 1-inch grub is a good combo. And I would note for those that might be traveling on the Delaware, that seems to be the new most common way to cast for shad, is to use a dart with a very small grub on it, as opposed to any bucktail or flashabou at all. And then lastly, I can't cover it nearly as well as Terry and Alex did, but all the different flies. And what I would note here, and all the guys who are listening could certainly appreciate this, but as was said earlier, short skirts in the springtime, that's what you're looking for. So I'd like to hone in on the chartreuse Shad Killer in the middle. If you notice, it has an incredibly bright, very short flashabou type skirt. And that's kind of the characteristic that you're going to look for in any shad fly. So some of these are crappie flies and panfish flies and different jigs. And while I've used most of them to fish for shad and caught fish on them, I would say that the bucktails on some of these are a bit too long to be effective. So look for something that's short and flashy. And I present you the Shad Killers just because Alex sells them at the boathouse. Alex uses them. Yeah, no more need be said. They work. So if you get a chance to pick a few up, try them out. I personally don't really use them a lot, but it's mainly because I have such a wide array of other fishing tackle that I don't necessarily want to add more to it at this time, but they definitely work. I'm going to quickly go through some opening day rigs, and I'm going to mainly just talk about the differences between them. So a lot of folks use a 3-way swivel. It's one of the easiest ways to tie. It involves more knots. It involves 5 knots, but it is very effective. You would put your heavier lure, in this case, the orange dart, on the shorter leader, normally between, say, 6 inches and a foot. And then you would put your lighter lure on the left, would be the tube bait, on the longer leader, normally anywhere between, say, 12, 14 inches and 2 feet, depending on how deep you were fishing. I tie all of these knots with Palomar knots, so pretty straightforward. On the right, barrel swivel, even simpler setup. That's 1 piece of line. The shad dart is strung up the line, and then just use a simple surgeon's loop, which is just an overhand knot 3 times to make that loop, and then I tie the lighter rig lower. Some people reverse that. I prefer to put the heavier lure up top and the lighter one down below. I believe it creates a little bit more action in that smaller lure bouncing around. There are plenty of folks who don't use any hardware at all, and that is certainly an option, particularly if you're going to use just 1 straight leader. I like to use the barrel swivel just because I rarely have to retie my braid line during a trip, but I'm retying the leaders a lot, and it just makes life easier. So the difference here is not really in the lures. That's just a matter of colors and personal preference. These are tied, again, using just 1 piece of line. And what I've done is made that surgeon's loop about 1/3 of the way into that line. So I've created an end That's 12 inches on one side and 24 on the other. And then I'm going to put that on the barrel swivel and then tie my lures onto it. And the beauty of that is it's very simple to tie on the river. You've got one simple loop knot and tie your 2 lures on, and all you do is put the loop through that barrel swivel and then put both lures back through it, and you're set to go. So it's a really simple thing to tie, and I think that's what makes it effective. And it will, if you get doubles or if you get snagged, you will occasionally break the line at that connection of the loop, but it hasn't happened to me often enough to make it a worry. Lastly, on the lures, just for those that are fishing from a boat and you want to maintain some depth control, there's a number of ways to do that. You can use a crankbait and a spoon. The crankbait's going to get down the water to whatever depth it normally dives to. So pick one that is close to the water depth you're fishing. You want to be, say, a foot or 2 off the bottom. Kind of neat to leave one off. It'll be wobbling about, and Shad will really smash that spoon when they want it. The other thing that, of course, you could do here is leave the treble hook or a hook on that crankbait, and you might attract stripers or other fish to it as well. On the right, the Carolina rig is the same type of rig that you would use for smallmouth bass or largemouth bass fishing. It's highly effective to fish from the bank. It casts very far. It usually stays together really well. It doesn't twist. And it gets you out 150, sometimes 200 feet, depending on the type of spinning rod you're throwing it on. And it can work really well in terms of depth control. I use it occasionally from a boat, but more often that's a shore rig. All right, with that, Ben, let me pause for a second and just talk through the lures and tackle a bit.
Cool, thanks, John. I have a couple of questions for you here. You touched on this a little bit, but when you say your go-to is a small dart, how small is small?
Yeah, it's a great question. So 1/8 definitely is the dart size I would start with, but I have plenty 1/16, 1/32. I have found that going smaller than like a 1/32 really just doesn't add a whole lot of value, because the hooks on a 1/64 ounce dart or 1/80 ounce panfish jig tend to be incredibly small and don't hold up very well with shad, because they're such powerful fish, and their mouths, other than like the strong sort of bony structure, that cartilage can give way easy. So you want a reasonable size hook of the size that Alex and Terry were tying. That 4 to 6 size is just about right, and you want it to be super sharp. So I would say anywhere from a 32nd to an 1/8. And if you're using jig heads and plastics, typically one will be a 16th, one will be an 1/8. Or if you're fishing shallow, go with 2 light ones. If you're fishing deeper, go with 2 1/8 ounce.
Awesome, thanks, John. And here's a great question too, from Mark Hagan. What's a good rig for kids?
Yeah, that is a good question. So I personally, if I was fishing with kids, I would stick with one lure, because even just the casting motion of throwing a double rig, they can sometimes tangle as you're trying to flip them out. So I would keep it as simple as possible. I would try to tie a direct uni to uni knot between a leader and the line, or if you were fishing just monofilament on your spinning reel, just tie a dart directly to the end of the line. And again, I would use an 1/8 ounce because it's an effective size. And then if you felt you weren't getting deep enough or casting far enough, just pinch a split shot above that about 12 inches. And that's probably where I would start if I was bringing a kid.
Awesome. And one more for you, John, before we go to the next section. This is an interesting one. So do you debarb your hooks?
It's a great question too. So it's difficult to find unless somebody else can weigh in. I have not really found any manufacturers of darts or jig heads that are using barbless hooks, and that's a shame. I wish there were more of them. I have on occasion crushed the barbs on my hooks, although my stance on that is that it seems like that may sometimes decrease the effectiveness of hooking up. So I'm not sure it makes a huge difference, in that shad rarely swallow a hook. If maybe 1 or 2 in 100 fish is deep hooked, or hooked in their gill plate or something, it's usually, since they're swiping at it, it's outside the mouth or just inside the mouth. So I don't think we injure too many fish by having them swallow, where a barbless hook would be really useful to get it out. But it's a great idea, and I certainly would encourage it if folks want to do it. And if anyone's aware of, I know for fly fishermen you can find barbless hooks to tie, but if anyone's aware of lures being made barbless, I'd love to know, because I certainly would patronize that shop.
Can I chime in on the barbless debate?
Of course.
So as much as we like to take photos of fish, and if it's your first shad or first shad of the season, or if it's a big American, that's great. Get it out of the water, take a photo. But if you fish barbless, you will actually catch more fish because you're spending less time unhooking fish. And true shad aren't going to swallow a hook all that often. But if you're barbless, you can just shake the fish off at the side of the boat or the shoreline or whatever. And you don't even have to touch the fish, which is very beneficial to it. And it's increasing the amount of time that you can cast and get your lures back in the water. And it's something I started doing recently with striped bass as well, because if they shake the hook, they shake the hook. It is what it is. But you get them to the boat, you shake them off the hook, and you're back in the water. You're catching more fish. So I'd be an advocate of that. Now, if it's your first couple times fishing and you just want to get some pictures and get on the board, then sure, fish with a barb. But there's no reason not to pinch a barb on a hook for shad.
Thanks. That's a great point.
You will catch more fish. I know it sounds crazy, but you'll get more bait. You'll get more lures in the water. I guarantee it.
Any other questions, Ben?
Yeah, actually one more here, and then let's go to the next section. Are only single hook lures allowed?
I want to say I believe so, but I'm not sure. A double hook, as in like, I'm trying to think, like an articulated fly that you might have a second hook on. Like, what type of double hook do you mean?
I think he's talking treble hooks.
Oh, no, I mean, I guess theoretically you could, and in some places they do use spinners like MEPS. In Boyd Pfeiffer's book, he talks about spinners being highly effective late in the season when the run is ending, and that's when that flash incentivizes the fish to feed. I don't throw trebles for shad. There are trebles on many of the spoons, like a Castmaster. I would encourage people to swap those out for an inline hook. So I think that, as Alex said, I think we would all collectively discourage the use of trebles. But no, you're allowed to use a spinner down at Fletcher's. I mean, lots of other fish would hit a spinner like a smallmouth or a striper. So.
Great, thanks, John.
Awesome. All right, I'll pick up with the techniques and how. So the most critical thing in shad fishing is depth, is figuring out where your lures are in the water column, and then repeating the casts or allowing line to spool out if you're just flatlining behind your boat. When you find where the fish are swimming in the water column, you want to make sure your lures are getting down to them. As I said earlier, American shad are most often on or near the bottom. Not always, though. It's sort of a misnomer that they're always near the bottom. We've caught them shallow, and as if you've read Mark's reports, you know that when the water is high in the Potomac and any other river, shad will often sort of stage in that shallow, non-moving water that's closer to shore. If they're taking a break, they don't want to be out in the raging current when the river's really high. So it is possible to catch them in shallower water, and depth is relative. If you're fishing in an area that's all about 4 feet, but you find a little chute in the bottom at a depression that's 5 or 6 feet, that might be your spot. If you're fishing in 16, 18 feet, and you find that little depression that's a couple feet deeper, that might be where you find the shad. So after you feel like you know where they are in the water column, it's also important to hone in on the rate retrieve and speed in action. And I think I have 2 great examples of this. One was when I first started fishing back in 1999, we were watching 2 ladies fly cast, and they were catching a ton of fish. And so we oared up next to them and we tried to figure out what they were doing. And they were subtly presenting flies, high in the water column, and getting bit all the time. And we could not work it out with our spinning tackle and just we were greenhorns at the time, and they must have caught 20 fish to every one. And another day, it's another reason why it's important to watch folks when you're on the river. I was down at one of my favorite spots at Walker's, and two fishermen beneath me were throwing their lures out, talking to each other, waiting about 6-7 seconds. I knew their lures had to be on the bottom. And then they were snap jigging those shad darts back as fast as they could, as if they were trying to make sure tarpon couldn't catch it. They were just going super fast, and they were catching fish. And sure enough, when I started to employ that retrieve speed and technique, my catch rate picked up that day as well. So keep your eyes open, watch what folks are doing that are catching. And sometimes those little nuances in retrieve speed, whether it's jigging, reeling straight, slow pauses, make a big difference in your success rate. So just quickly, if you're in a boat, obviously besides trying to find those seams, you can cast from both sides of that boat, figure out which way the fish are facing, and then learn to count down your lures, learn where your lure is in that water column, and then as you begin catching, repeat that same approach. And that's what's really difficult, is that sometimes you catch a couple of fish and you're not sure exactly what you did to make it happen. And so repeating it is a problem. So when you're shad fishing, if you want to catch a lot, make sure you're paying attention to exactly what you're doing, where your lure is, how the swing is occurring, and where you're getting bit, because you're going to get bit there again. I mentioned a couple times dead sticking or flatlining, very similar to folks that are using downriggers on other rivers. Mike Alper, this is the way he fishes. He puts rod holders out. He determines how deep the water is where he's fishing, and he tries to get his lures just about a foot or so off the bottom. And knowing the spots as well as he does, he's often where the fish are. And as the fish are coming in, you're going to catch them if you're in the right spot. And if you're not, you won't. So if you feel like you're in a good spot, change lures when the action stops or it doesn't start, but make sure that you're testing various parts of the water column. And for hickories especially, that means from top to bottom. There are some days that you will get bit as soon as your dart hits the water. And it can be a heck of a lot of fun to cast out and get bit within a second or two and just keep catching fish that way. So this is quickly what it looks like. These are pictures from David Hills. In this picture, I've cast perpendicular to the bank. So if the bow of the boat is 12 o'clock, I'm casting out to about 3 or 4 o'clock. And I'm gonna probably open the bail a little bit, let a few feet of line out, and let that lure swing down the current seam we're fishing. And in this photo, you could see that both Phil and I have our lures behind the boat. We're connected to those lures, the line's tight, they're on the seam that we're fishing, and we're just waiting for bites. We're sort of keeping them off the bottom, and we're gonna keep them there for a couple seconds. And then if we don't get any bites, we'll probably reel them in, sometimes quickly if we don't think there's any fish on the way in, sometimes more slowly if we think there might be a chance for fish to be caught. And in this case, you could see that while David was photographing, I hooked up on that cast. And what I'd like to point out about this is these are not tuna. You want to stay connected to the fish. There's no need to pump your rod. You're using light tackle. Use the bend of your rod. Shad run. They occasionally jump. You want to stay connected to them at all times. I prefer a light drag. Some folks keep their drag fairly tight and then, or keep it fairly loose and then tighten it as the fish gets closer to the boat. I tend to either keep mine the same throughout the fight or actually loosen it by the boat, because it's oftentimes when you're trying to net a shad or control it in some way that you're going to lose it. So, and in this case, we got lucky, we got a fish, and we quickly released the little buck shad. So everybody talks a lot about color in shad fishing. My keys to shad fishing are find the right position, the right depth, and the right retrieve. But it's a friendly bunch. You're going to ask them anyway, so go ahead and ask what color are they biting. Everyone's going to have an answer. And as Terry said earlier, it's probably whatever color you're throwing if you're in the right spot. But there are days that no doubt it can be baffling that you put a new color on or you change from green to white or chartreuse to orange and suddenly start catching, only to go into another lull and have to time another new color to get them to start biting. I'm going to touch real quickly, guys, on boat positioning. And it's a real simple one. Just follow the golden rule, respect other people's position, and remember that because you're casting out to the sides of your boat and then allowing the lure to go swing behind the boat, one of the biggest mistakes that people make in anchoring next to somebody else is they anchor too close beneath the boat that's already fishing. So if I'm fishing, I'm typically going to be casting 100, 150 feet out, and then it's going to swing behind the boat, and I might let out more line. So if you come by and smile and say hello, that's great. And then you park, 50 feet behind me, you're parking where I'm fishing. So, you're going to want to move off on an angle or go further down or off to the side. Typically speaking, it's safer to anchor to the side of somebody than it is directly beneath them. And as I showed before, this is what it looks like when an expert like Mike anchors up. You can see his distance from the other boat, and he's sort of catty corner to that boat. And so both of these vessels are going to have no problem fishing in the seams that they wanted to fish. And on the left is it's an interesting camera angle because I'm in the boat. I'm the little green guy in the boat way down by the shore. These boats are much closer than they appear based on this camera angle. But again, you could see on the diagonal space between the craft, nobody behind each other. So you've allowed plenty of distance. So I wanted to importantly point out some safety things. Canoes and kayaks are becoming more and more common. I want to give you 5 things to consider if you're coming out in a kayak or a canoe. Don't do it without your PFD on. Dress for immersion in the water. In the last 3 years at Fletcher's, I've personally witnessed each year somebody fall out of their kayak and have to swim back to shore. I think 2 times those were kayaks rented from the boathouse, and the other time it was somebody in a personal craft. They were all okay. None of those people were wearing a wetsuit. None of those people were wearing a dry suit. I would highly recommend, although I didn't in the past, I now own both dry suits and wetsuits. Wear your PFD, wear a dry suit or a wetsuit, have a quick release anchor. You can see in this photo, the red rope is my anchor rope. It's on a cleat right next to me. If anything goes wrong and I feel like I'm being pulled in the wrong direction or a log has hit my anchor, I just pop it. It's floating line. Hopefully I can catch up with it. And if I can't, it's just an anchor. It's a bag of rocks. I'll get it back. So be careful out there. Definitely, don't anchor in fast moving water. It's just not worth it. Just be very cautious about how you're fishing. As we said, the shad fishing bite can get hot when the water temperature is in the 50s. That's really cold to be falling in the Potomac. So netting fish. Shad like to swim downstream very fast when they're near your boat. So you should be downstream of the fish. They're going to dive deep and they're going to go downstream. In this picture, I had the great fortune of taking John Graebner out. John has passed, but he was a gentleman and a fine fisherman. And he has on that really nice, probably 4-pound American shad. And it was on the lightest rod that I happened to bring that day for him. So he must have fought that fish for a good 10, 12 minutes. And when it finally came to the boat, it dove and I got totally lucky and scooped him up. And you could see the results there. And John actually said shortly after that made it his best trip ever to Fletcher. So that definitely meant something to me. I was glad that I didn't screw up that netting job. And this is Bob Smith. You guys know Bob. He's a fantastic fly fisherman. And I think the most important thing to point out here is that he's got a very long handled net. It's got that safe netting for the fish. And you could see how far he's leaning back to get that American shad. And so that shad's probably done exactly the same thing. As it got close to the boat, it wanted to go downstream. And Bob had to reel it back in and get it in the net. So, when all goes well, you get these guys. And so on the left, many of you know Josh Cohen. That is just an amazing picture by none other than Alex, your boathouse manager. And Josh took that beautiful American shad on a fly rod from his tiny green bathtub that none of us are quite sure how he oars out and fishes from, but he does catch a lot of fish. And on the right is Sarah Shop again. And Sarah's proving there that not only can she catch hickories from the shore, but she can catch big Americans from a boat. And her and her dad had some phenomenal days last year. And I know Sarah won't soon forget that day because I remember the report that her dad sent, and it was pretty darn exciting in terms of the size and numbers of American shad that they were able to reel in. So wrap up on the how, some common sense secrets. If your dart's not in the water, you're not catching fish. And by the way, these secrets are from John McPhee and Boyd Pfeiffer and Buddy Grusella, the guys who write books about shad fishing. And my story on this one's pretty funny. I've seen plenty of people oar out with 2 or 3 people in the boat, and then, you know, it's dark, it's 6 o'clock in the morning, they've got headlamps on, they're trying to tie their lures, they're trying to figure out how to anchor, and they literally spend an hour before they make their first cast. And if you have that kind of patience, I envy you and I want to be more like you, but I'm not at all. So if you want to catch fish, rig up your rods, bring a couple with you, and get to it. Like, don't waste your time on the banks, you know, rigging everything up. Be ready. Be quiet when you're shad fishing. Stealth matters. It matters in all fishing. I can tell you personally, we noticed that when a boat goes by with a motor, both the sound of the motor and the wake it makes often throw off the bite if it happens to be hot. Those who fish rivers where there are train tracks running parallel to the river will note that you almost never catch a shad when a train is going by. We've talked about it before. Copying other fishermen's free. You'll learn. Do it. It's worth the loss of pride. And John McPhee says it's a bad idea to horse a shad. I agree. Take your time. You know, if they come off the hook, like Alex said, there'll be another one. You get them to the net. It's wonderful. Last slide on the common sense stuff. Touch and feel. You've got it or you don't. They say that the best shad fishermen have a sixth sense, and they know when fish are going to bite. It's described in great detail in about 10 pages in McPhee's book. There are guys that say they actually know when the fish opens its mouth in the water, so they're ready to set the hook. I'm not that guy. I've had that experience maybe for a couple of hours in my life, but that's your goal. If you can this year have a moment in time where you feel like you know when the fish is going to bite, that's when you know you're really dialed into them. In terms of electronics, they're not at all necessary. You're not going to see shad on your depth finder, but they are very useful in terms of learning the river, learning the different spots at Fletcher's. And so I would say use it for that. I would also say if there's anyone on the line with an expensive boat, a bass boat, be careful. There's lots of boulders at Fletcher's. Learn where those are. I've seen a lot of people cruise up next to us while we're fishing close to a set of boulders. And, you know, at any moment, they could be losing, you know, a $30,000 bass boat to the bottom of the river if they take the engine off the back. So be careful. And then also be careful of the old catch-22 of shad fishing, which is that good days are so awesome sometimes that you're ruined for any other later angling. There's guys that say that after the shad season ends, they're finally ready for some serious fishing because shad fishing can be so fun and easy. And these are some of the shots of what it looks like when Phil and I are successful. And as I said before, many of these are years old now. We often come home with very few pictures at this point. But there are some amazing fish to be caught in the Potomac, and hopefully you've got a few tips on how to do that now. Ben, one last break before I wrap up.
John, I think I'm going to let you go right to the end. We have a few more questions, but I think we can probably group them all right at the end.
Excellent. So the who is really simple. You know Mark's reports. You've heard about them. You know where Alex is at the boathouse. Give him a call. You can call me anytime as well. Most shad fishermen, it is really true. It's a friendly bunch. Folks help each other out. Folks are courteous on the riverbank. It's great to see. So take advantage of your network and your advisors. I'm happy to send folks these links, but you can find the shad reports at NCCTU. The Little Falls gauge is important to monitor river levels. I'm happy to share with you, you know, Alex will tell you that above 5 feet, generally, he's not going to be renting boats and you have to be extra careful. My advice there would be if Alex isn't renting boats that are a lot more stable than your canoe, you probably shouldn't go out either. Or if you do, you have to be really careful when you're out there. NOAA's Potomac River forecast is a longer range forecast. It's not always highly accurate, but it is interesting to look at because it's a reflection of all of the rainfall in the watershed and how it might ultimately in the future affect the levels at Little Falls. So it is good to look at. And of course, you heard from Friends of Fletcher's Cove. And my final thoughts are, get to the river when they're running. Find that good spot and the right depth in the water column. Dial in the bite. Be polite to your new friends. If you have the inclination, please join. Try to limit it in the National Capital chapter and donate to Friends of Fletcher's Cove. Sign up for that title, Potomac River Slam. And by all means, you're welcome to contact me anytime. Love to talk about fishing and love to provide the one-page handout that I talked about earlier. So it would be great to talk to folks. And that is my email and phone.
Awesome. John, thank you so much. What an enormous amount of information to process. So much there. Really, really appreciate that. And one of the most frequent questions actually we've gotten is if it will be possible to make a version of this presentation available, if we could send that out or post it or so people can digest some of this, after the event.
Yes. So a couple of things. Anyone who wants to send me their email, I'm happy to share the slides on Google Drive. And then, as I said, I know it sounds odd, but almost every word in this presentation is in the one-page handout that I've created for Shad Night, just as a real simple means of sharing that information. So by all means, let me know. I'll get you access to it. I would say that I could create a PDF, Ben, but to be honest, I've tried and there's so many pictures that it winds up still being too big to email successfully.
No, that's perfect. Thanks, John. And we'll make sure to everyone on the call, we'll make sure that we send out that one pager from John to the Shad list and to our newsletter list, as well as posting it on our website. John, one quick question, and then we have a couple questions for the panelists, but I'm conscious that we're already past 9:30. But could you just quickly talk electric motors?
Oh, sure. We've been using electric motors for the red boats at Fletcher's now for years. I bring a very basic, 30, 35 pound thrust Minn Kota that cost about $120 with a single battery. So it's a 12-volt system. It's all you need. It's certainly beneficial in a sense that sometimes it can be difficult to row, particularly upstream in an outgoing tide. Alex, I'm sure, can chuckle about how many times he's had to go out with a motor and actually save somebody. There are days when my brother and I were close to being in that boat where we could barely get past Walker's Point in a strong wind. So if you have it, I encourage you to use it. I know that I've seen some people out in kayaks that have trolling motor setups. Kind of a cool thing to have as well. I don't on my kayak, but real simple and easy to get on the red boats. So if you have one, I think it's a good idea to bring it.
Great. And John, one back to the where question. This will be the final question for the evening. Have you seen any, or are there any Chad in 4 Mile Run?
In 4 Mile Run, that's a good question. That's a Rob Snowwhite question, I think, with all the fishing he does locally. I'm not sure. I would suspect there may be herring. I don't know if there's any hickory or American shad in 4 Mile Run.
I would agree with you that it's herring only. Maybe not enough flow or a wide enough waterway to get shad up there. Now, last year was the first year that I ever saw a picture in a confirmed hickory shad caught in Rock Creek. But I've not heard 4 Mile Run. Herring for sure, though.
And that was great news, Alex, and wonderful to have it been reported. I think, generally speaking, in terms of new places that you're going to find shad, I suspect it's going to be those rivers where NOAA and the Nature Conservancy and the Army Corps of Engineers are working on dam removals. So as those most lowest dams are removed from tributaries that used to support runs, those hickory and American shad will come back, because that's been, those are the barriers that have prevented them from use of those streams. Some of these other streams, I suspect now are degraded to the point where they wouldn't be attractive spawning habitat, particularly for Americans.
Great. Well, here we are at 9:40. I'd really like to thank everyone who's stuck with us. Really well attended event tonight, more than 200 people, just incredible. As well as thanking everyone